Hi.
Hello.
Howdy.
Hi,
Hey, hey.
everyone, and welcome to the Q&A for the disappearing of Vincent Gambini. I have with me today Augusto Corrieri and Hugo Glendinning, who are the makers of the film. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Debbie, for being here. Yeah.
It's my pleasure as well. I'm beaming in from East London from my living room.
Oh, we can't be far from each other then. I'm there as well.
Yeah, perfect. So why don't we start with, I know that there's a kind of fictional, well, how much of the film is fiction? If I can start with that question. Is that a question you shouldn't ask in a magic context? Does that break the illusion?
That's really interesting. Yeah, 23% is fictional. It's funny, isn't it? Because actually, sometimes it's hard, anyway, for me when I rewatch it to actually remember which parts might be fictional and which aren't. And also because, well, I guess part of the premise of the film was this idea of the show having to be cancelled, but the show itself was already a magician in crisis needing to cancel his show. And so then the fictional cancellation of the Tour of Enchantment became a real cancellation. So there's this kind of, I guess there's this interplay between the real and the fictional and a kind of blurriness between the two all the time. Having said that, there are definite things in the show in the film, which are, blatant lies. We're here having a Q&A. So obviously me and Hugo, I wasn't trying to desperately reach Hugo. I wasn't kind of like, are you there?
Well, there was truth in that. The thing is, the very first conversation is a real thing. Augusto did phone me up and he did record it, which actually established a way of continuing a dialogue, sometimes a real one and sometimes a constructed one. So a lot of what actually went into the film was said in those recordings, but sometimes we were so incoherent when speaking with each other that it was useful to rewrite it.
You mentioned dialogue, Hugo, and I would love to know more about how dialogue works in particular in this film, both in terms of the process for the film and in terms of your mediums. Augusto being someone who comes from performance, yourself being someone who comes from filmmaking, and then also the idea of magic. Yeah, what is the role of dialogue in terms of both the process and the content in this film?
Well, for me, almost all my work I consider to be dialogue. So I don't, even though some of it is visual communication, I'm frequently involved with makers who might be writers, who might be artists, and in order to realize all sorts of projects, a very extensive dialogue is necessary. It never isn't a dialogue, because in a way it's the only way to bridge these divides between different practices, and to understand really what Augusto is doing and what he wants to make and what's going to be interesting for us to make. It requires dialogue. So it's essential. It's the essence of the thing for me.
Yeah. I was wondering about that, because I've often worked in a solo context or with a solo approach, which of course doesn't mean that you're working alone, because you're always sort of, to some extent, working with others, even if it's just the audience. You're sort of, it's always a kind of relationship. But certainly Gambini has been a solo adventure up to this point, with people coming in to watch or give advice, that kind of thing. But this project was really, for me, it was super interesting to actually open up the world of Gambini through this dialogue with Hugo, because it's sort of, I think if nothing, it really has allowed me to look at it and look at the show in a really different way. So for example, there's this section in the film where we show some of the I call it private rehearsal footage. Maybe that's a bit too ambitious a term, but you know, just these like crap videos that I film when I'm developing bits of the show. And you know, if it were my film alone, there's no way I would be sharing that material, because I'd just be sort of this is kind of private. I've never shown that footage to anyone, but something about working with Hugo and trusting the process and the dialogue meant that Hugo was kind of making choices about, I've assembled these rehearsal videos of you, and now they're in the film. And I was like, oh, okay, shit. And but there's something about, you know, just the way it opens up the kind of the space that would otherwise be alone, this kind of very private rehearsal moment suddenly becomes sculpted because we're in dialogue. And so, for me, it was really fantastic. I guess an example of how a dialogue can sort of open up maybe a space that might otherwise be very private and that I would never have shared. So that's what comes to mind, Debbie, when you ask about, dialogue.
Yeah, I just can I just put a little tiny end on that? I remember when first showing that sequence to Augusto and him like, oh my God, do we really need that last one where I've dropped the card, it's boring. I said, yeah, but that's got all the magic text in it. That's got the language of magic. I can't remember, what is it? The in jogging and the side slip. Yeah. And I was like, I love hearing that. That's so exciting to hear that, because where else are you going to get that? So I knew that was kind of secret and wonderful to have this little window on.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting because I did some dramaturgical work on the Tour of Enchantment a few years back, a couple of years ago now. And I remember, Augusto, you mentioned like that it was difficult in some ways to do some of the development of the show because of the sheer amount of practice you needed to continue to do to keep the tricks in a good place. And so it was particularly interesting for me to see that practice, for us to like actually have a kind of window in on that, because it seemed like that was an element of the show that, as the Tour of Enchantment existed, was basically almost impossible to really share with an audience without robbing them of something. Whereas sharing it in this context, in the context of a film, it felt like a very sort of like true and real and important moment.
I guess that's one of the weird things of, to go back to the theme of solitude, perhaps, not that I'm particularly obsessed with it, but like the magician's craft, like for so many people, like it's so it's very, very private. I guess it goes back to that, and it's very, magicians are a sort of very strange breed of people, because put them all in one place and it's just like this kind of party of geeks basically going, I've figured out a new way to get the card from this position to that position, and literally just like hours, weeks, years spent on getting the card from that position to this position. And but it's really hard therefore to communicate to non-magicians, or otherwise known as lay people, because it's so specialist and sort of and kind of unique. And I guess, and typically mostly people think, oh, there's a trick to it, which of course is true. And the trick is XYZ. The trick is the card is secretly slipped to the bottom or something like that. But of course, there's also misdirection and there's psychology, and it's a whole combination of things. And it gets really tricky to share all of that with an audience, I guess, in normal circumstances. And typically you wouldn't want to, because like we were saying earlier about the fiction, it's just one of those limits to magic. Like you can't really, sort of reveal how it's done without sort of fundamentally altering what it is, which is an experience of wonder and mystery, because you've just sort of, it's not real, and yet it looks like the coin is melting into thin air, so you're kind of in conflict about what you're seeing and what you know to be true. And that just generates this feeling of kind of, sort of stupor and wonder and enchantment at the best of times anyway. So I don't know, I'm getting a bit lost in that. But this film was interesting because from a magician's perspective, there is a bit of revelation that goes on here, like more than most magicians would be comfortable with, I think. I'd be wrong. But, even like when I'm making the coins disappear, and you can sort of see that I'm tossing them into my shirt, that would be like, I mean, to a lot of magicians, that's like, oh, they know they don't actually disappear, you know. But yeah, I think for me, I'm very inspired by the magical duo Penn and Teller, because they really have a fantastic way of playing, almost flirting with revelation, sometimes sharing some aspects, but never the whole thing. And I just think it's beautiful because it really allows the audience into the world of magic, as opposed to this weird, like, men's club of secrecy, which, I mean, it's really, it's so dispiriting. You know, there's so much about magic that's dispiriting and that can be sort of changed. So I think there is a way of sharing some of how magic is done, or something about the world of magic, like you were saying, Debbie, like, for example, the process of rehearsing, because it just, I think it creates a bit of parity in it, and it creates a bit more understanding. I don't consider myself fully a magician because it's not totally what I do, but I think the more there's a sense of understanding of what magicians do, I think that's just got to be the best, you know, the way forward. Otherwise it's this kind of, this man who doesn't tell you how it's done. I mean, there's nothing more ridiculous, I think, than a dude standing on stage going, ha, I've just done something amazing and you don't know how it's done. I mean, that's the most revolting thing I can think of. So anything that's going to counter that is going to be welcome.
Well, I was wondering, in terms of film as a medium, I know that you had posted something on social media a few days ago, Augusto, that was a screenshot from the television show Love, about when they go to the Magic Castle. And Paul Rust, who's one of the writers of that show, apparently recently in a podcast said something about how he really hates magic on film because there's no way to really believe in it when it's on film. And it's not, you know, like the thing of seeing the king appear over and over again, for example, in this film. I've seen that trick in person and it's very exciting. But what was more exciting when I was watching it on film was watching you practice it rather than watching the trick itself. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could both speak a little bit to the way that, like, trickery and editing and the kind of magic of cinema, how that worked with the idea of the magic of Gambini, and how, when that didn't work, and then how you sort of resolved that or made an asset of that conflict.
Yeah. Shall I try first, Hugo?
Go ahead, do your magic. Do a trick.
do a trick. Yeah, it's a funny one. I mean, and it's funny because we're in the middle of, well, it's an ongoing pandemic, and so a lot of magicians I know are doing shows via Zoom, and there's all this debate is very hot in the magic community. But I'm definitely like, I think the reason I like magic is as a live form of performance, because it looks like CGI, it looks like a video trick, but it's live. So if you do it on a video, then it's a bit like, oh, maybe it is CGI or something. I don't know. You know, there's always that sort of suspicion that it's not actually, it wouldn't look like that if it were done in front of you. And so I've always pursued close-up magic because it looks like a special effect, but it's happening in front of your very eye. So my approach to magic, which is, of course, it's just very subjective, is that it needs to be a live form of performance. But having said that, so I'll say that. And then to kind of inch back into the film, I think part of the reason that, for example, the film is under Hugo's name and my real name. It's not a film by Vincent Gambini and Hugo Glendinning. And I think it's because I recognize this isn't a magic film in the sense of trying to showcase magic as an art form. It's more like around magic, shall we say. But several of the films that I love, and I mentioned one of them in one of the my messages to Hugo in the film, By the Time It Gets Dark. I just kind of, I've just grown so obsessed in recent years, or maybe forever, I don't know, with these films where you can't even tell if what you're seeing is a film or a documentary, or perhaps it kind of moves between the two. And it just creates this wonderful space of uncertainty and ambiguity. And you cannot fully say, I know what's happening here. And when it's done well, I feel like it's really close to magic, that feeling of not knowing. And so By the Time It Gets Dark, this film, it's a Thai female director called Anosha Suichakornpong. And it just, you sort of think, you think you're watching the preparation of a film, but then you realize actually, no, that was the film. And yeah, so that it's kind of really close to magic for me. I've seen quite a few films, maybe the films of Hong Sang-soo, South Korean director as well. They similarly just kind of play with, and of course Mulholland Drive is the big kahuna, I guess, the big don of all these examples, where it just sort of like moves and opens up into something where you are left thinking, oh, I don't know anymore. And that is, to me, that's very close to the effect that magic can produce, although it's through very, very different means. But yeah, I don't know, does that, yeah.
I think if we sort of take it further into the sort of technical language of filmmaking and editing, what we did was to try and make very, very slow versions of what might be the big reveals or disappearings that might happen through editing or clever juxtapositions of imagery. So, for example, we have the biggest clunk of all at the end, where Augusto or Vincent Gambini disappears from his chair. I mean, that wasn't planned, it was just possible. So in a way, if you're going to do it, and do it right at the end. That's it. Bang, you've done that one. Because prior to that, we've already had a guy in Brighton, as Augusto's talking about what magicians do. They make things appear and they make things disappear. And as he says, disappear, a bloke walks down some steps very slowly. I mean, he is going to disappear, but he never quite disappears. But so, we know that these are things are connected, and that we're talking about the same thing, and we're showing something that is a bit like that thing. But in a way, it's trying to avoid the full-on cliche of making magic by making movies. And there are other examples of that. Would be, for example, the long sequence where the actual audience from one of Vincent Gambini's shows, from The Chore of Enchantment, is sort of laughing and clapping, and we have the empty streets and things like that. And you start realizing that the sequence is edited so that they're actually laughing or clapping at something. So when a bloke walks past with his shirt off, they laugh. Or when the plastic bag flies into the air, they laugh. The biggest laugh is the plastic bag in the air. And in a way, that's because that's a movie cliche, of loneliness. So let's laugh at the movie cliche. So those sorts of things are in there, and they're a kind of magic trick to take people away from the banality of the moment, if you like.
In terms of talking about the process of editing, we did have a little kind of pre-chat a couple of days ago, and I just thought it would be interesting to point out to the viewers now. Hugo, you didn't shoot any of the footage, did you?
No, I didn't touch it. No. I straightened some of it, but I didn't shoot any of it.
So, what was the conversation about shooting? How did that work?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess it was an ongoing dialogue. It was a case of me going out in last summer, and very much like an amateur in the sense of just I think because I enjoy film so much, so having like a go at working purely visually, and that was super enjoyable. And then just generating lots of footage and sort of sending it to Hugo. For Hugo to kind of make selections, and there was a lot of openness there, because often you'd send back like an edit and I'd be like, oh, you've chosen those 3 things, okay, great, so there's a sort of a real sense of unknowing as well for me in terms of what might come back, or and then you would make suggestions for maybe like, okay, I think we need something like this, can you go back and film yourself looking out the window, but you need to be lit in this way, so then I'd sort of be working on commission a little bit and sort of have a sense of direction, have a sense of like, okay, I think actually you need to do one of these, and I mean that's the sort of very nitty-gritty aspect. I don't know if there are more things to
I mean, for example, a lot of the things that I needed, I mean, so many things that Augusto did were done very well and were just there, and it was more like a big pool of source material for me. The things that needed refining, I mean, and encouraging were things like just looking out of the window, really, making sure that we had enough night material so that we could change moods, things like that, which were and also the kind of gaze from inside to outside. So the things that made Augusto feel a bit awkward, like looking in other people's windows, the voyeuristic stuff, I had to kind of push for.
I am very curious to know if that was your cat or not, Augusto.
No, that was a lockdown cat.
Oh, it was great. It was great.
Yeah.
We're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. And if you wanted to put up a question, you can do that in the live chat function on YouTube. We have one question already. You mentioned the films that you watched while making the show and that partially inspired The Chore of Enchantment, the theater show. What films did you watch while making this film? And I suppose maybe, you don't have to mention the reality shows that you watched unless they directly inspired. But I suppose, which films did you watch that sort of also, were adjacent or inspirational to this?
Yeah. There are a few. So actually, one film that we didn't mention in the film, but we were going to sort of work with a bit, was this cinephile classic La Jetée by Chris Marker, which is this very unusual film in that it's photograms, it's stills, basically black and white stills all the way through. There's no, as far as I can remember, there's no motion. So it's just stills, and it's got this sort of fantastic, I guess, time paradox where, without spoiling it, the future event that's sort of predicted coincides with a memory. So there's a kind of future and past sort of paradox that's at work. And that really inspired one of the narrative structures for the show. The show was sort of premised in its final version. It went through so many versions, The Chore of Enchantment. It took 3 or 4 years before I found something that I was kind of like happy with or happy enough. It was very much a case of a sort of second album, kind of process. But so the Chris Marker film certainly influenced it for this idea of working with that time paradox. And so The Chore of Enchantment, the idea was that this was a reenactment or a kind of dream memory of my last show, which I was now just kind of going over and over again in my head, but was also being presented live. And then I think a couple of, we were going to work with that a bit in the film, me and Hugo, but by trying to reenact some of the Chris Marker film, but we realized that was sort of like another project. So, but a couple of other things. I think one I want to mention is, I forget the title for it, but it's based on the, is it Tristram Shandy novel?
Yes, of course.
Steve Coogan.
Yeah, with Steve Coogan and I think it's called Tristram Shandy.
Yeah, is it like, I've got Bull and
Cock and Bull Story.
Cock and Bull Story, yeah. And just like, I'm not the film as a whole necessarily, but there are certain scenes, for example, I seem to remember one with Steve Coogan now where he's in front of a mirror and he's practicing hurting himself in some way. He's practicing and he's kind of like I can't remember now exactly what, but he's practicing hurting himself. And then he suddenly actually hurts himself for real, and then kind of has to suffer the consequences of that. But he's still acting, and just kind of loving, I guess, those moments where the rehearsal of the thing becomes real. So moments from films like that, lots of like little moments from BoJack Horseman, for example, the animated series. Twin Peaks, I think, big time. I think that was kind of the series 3 was out when I was making the film. So there's a lot of magic in Twin Peaks, an awful lot of like actual magic, like coins disappearing and levitating. And yeah. So those were some of the films that came in when I was making the Chore of Enchantment. Anyway.
Mine aren't nearly as sophisticated. my film viewing under lockdown's largely been governed by what my children want to watch. So, I mean, magic related, but not particularly interesting would be the entire oeuvre of Harry Potter, of course, and read out loud through a year of lockdown as well.
Oh wow!
Which was
wow,
my
you've
big
been reading it
achievement
out loud with the kids?
I read all of it, every word out loud.
Wow, that is an achievement.
It is. I don't
Well,
think
that would definitely have some impact.
Yeah, but I think Michael Winterbottom is quite an influence on me as well. I mean, I loved The Trip, and so I think our interests do coincide, mine and Augusto's, on many of those things. I'd also say that I don't know why I watched it, but I watched a film about Nick Cave to try and get into Brighton. And he actually gave me a really great steer when he was talking about how he composes music and how he lays down all this beautiful stuff, the sensible things. And then he says he invites the clowns in to disrupt what's all the beautiful stuff. And he called it counterpoint, which is a musical term, but it actually fed into how I was trying to describe to Augusto the way of combining these two very different things, the text that we were discussing and the imagery as a kind of counterpoint.
Wonderful. The clowns. Who are these clowns?
I think it's just when he starts writing crazy shit, you know.
He doesn't like literally, I don't know, invite some kind of strange jazz musicians to come.
No, I think they're his own clowns, you know, inside him.
Yeah, fantastic. We have another question here. It was interesting that I experienced the magician's gulp when I saw the effects slightly revealed, particularly when I know it's now on film. I can't seem to shake that feeling. How do you cope?
I wonder if this is a magician.
I suppose it's a magician there.
Right.
It's the person who, you threw the coin into the shirt and they flipped out.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fantastic question. And I guess it goes back to how we think of magic, because I think there's a tendency, and it's tradition, it's the weight of tradition. And it's fair enough that it exerts a powerful influence because we think of tradition as somehow true and right at the end of the day. Maybe somewhere inside of us, we think, sure, tradition might be wrong in lots of ways, but at the end of the day, isn't it right? And I think there's a lot of that in the magic community. There's this feeling that tradition and history and lineage has to be respected, and any deviation from that is going to some extent be a bit wrong. Anyway, so I think there's partly it's that, but a couple of things about this reveal, which I think connect a little bit to film in general. One is the idea that people forget. So after you show them how a trick is done, they forget. You can tell someone exactly what you're doing. I had this experience recently doing a small magic workshop. I showed people how I was doing the trick, and then I did it again, and they were fooled. And it's just because magic is really, like, when it's done well, not to blow my own trumpet or anything, but when it's done, when the deception works, people are fooling themselves, and they're fooling themselves because just certain patterns of expectation, we're constantly predicting what's going to happen, we're constantly assuming what's going to happen. And so unless you're really reminding people, hey, I'm not actually taking the coin, I'm making it look like I take the coin. Unless you're actively reminding people and turning them into magicians, which is a long process, people forget, and people will immediately revert back to being fooled. So I think there's that to say. And so the revelation, I think, is a temporary phenomenon, which I think could be explored in its own right. And the other idea to say on that, which again comes from Penn and Teller, this Las Vegas duo of magicians, and it's going to, it's a clangor for magicians. But the idea, and it totally contradicts what I've just said, but people already know it's a trick. And some people already know how the trick is done. And magicians, I think, are often in denial about that. And they think that applause and kind of wonder and like, wow, means that people are just so baffled, But if you actually spend some time with people who've been to see David Copperfield, David Blaine, talk to those people. And after a while, you realize shit, they actually know how it's done. Like, you know, if you really talk to a lot of people know about a fake transfer of a coin. A lot of people know that you might have a thumb tip in which you hide the handkerchief that vanishes. A lot of people know actually quite a few little principles of magic. And so I wonder if actually, what if we approach it in that way, that actually audiences know how magic is done? I mean, obviously they don't, but to some extent there's a feeling of like a shared humanity, shared methods of deception. So yeah, I don't know, that's one way of thinking anyway that gets me.
Perhaps it's like less about the trick and more about the execution, you know, enjoying watching the execution. But it also made me think a little bit about editing, because if you've ever been involved with a film set, I mean, I sometimes think about the fact that people who are filmmakers and actors, etc., have probably been binge watching television and film the same way that anyone else binge watches it. And they know, of course, that, you know, one side, that might not be the same room, you know, and that there were lights on one side and there weren't lights on the other side. And like they know that there's a artificiality, you know, that's being hidden by the editing. And yet, because we're human beings and we want to invest in the thing that we're watching and enjoy it, we have a way of just forgetting, of just turning it off, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, this would be, Hugo, do you get frequently distracted while you're watching films by the execution or the editing, or sometimes are you just like, you know what, fuck it, I'm not going to think about that?
Sometimes I have to deliberately stop thinking about it, because I do think about it and I watch how things are done. You know, I kind of watch beneath what's happening quite frequently. Sometimes if I really want to see the film as a work, I have to stop myself doing that, and that can be quite a difficult thing to do sometimes. But I was reminded of really from what Augusto was saying, was that whenever I've been in rehearsal situations, and I've frequently been in on rehearsed readings, things like that, where I've been shooting pictures of actors or whatever, I've always felt that what the actors do in rehearsed readings, where they kind of make it up on the spot, is far more interesting than watching anything on stage. And now this isn't necessarily true of film, which is a slightly different thing, but actually the sense that somebody is processing the information and giving it to you amazingly brilliantly all in one moment is far more exciting for me than seeing a very, very well executed play, which is like the big trick. You know, to see the whole trick in one go, it's always kind of left me a bit cold. And these fragmentary moments of brilliance that you see in rehearsals, and actually you do see in films, because people are rushed to do things. It's a very different process. You know, it isn't a finished trick, it's only finished at the end. And you choose the things that work best together and make sense together. But, you know, obviously some directors will go to the 58th take and make it exactly what they want it, but that rarely happens. So you kind of know that the actors in films are much more on edge, much more in the moment in a way. Whereas on stage, I've always felt we are seeing some polished trick. And I've never particularly liked that. Whereas, you know, which is in a way why I got so excited seeing his Augusto's personal videos. I just loved it.
I do have to ask, how much convincing was involved in getting those personal videos into the film? Was it something that Augusto just like immediately said, you know, I've got this footage, let's use it? Or was it something, Hugo, that you had to kind of suggest and
I don't
push?
think I had to push it very hard. I made it very clear that I loved it. And I think after that, it wasn't really an issue.
I think I had to convince myself a little bit, and I think every time I see it a little bit, it's just that I think I'm not like, for example, a social media person who sort of shares their life, their private life. So suddenly kind of like, I'm aware, for example, now I'm sort of on set, so to speak, this kind of this strange sense in which, of course, this is the flat that features, and there's something about opening that up for view, which I'm still a bit like, uncomfortable with. But like I said, I totally trust it as well. And I thought, yeah, it makes sense. It makes total sense. So
yeah, well, it's clearly a very effective part of the film because we've discussed it at length, so it worked. So final question, which also comes from one of the audience members. Do you know if Vincent Gambini will perform again live on stage?
Yeah, no, I don't actually. I think personally, I'm very much in this kind of one day at a time mode of existing. I think the different speeds that people are at because of the pandemic, you know, people are sort of like already over it, or people who are still totally actually really, really, you know, concerned, for example, about going outside. I think those speeds are now changing in the UK context. But I'm still very much at the level where, I mean, the film is released today, fantastic. And the film to me is a sort of mark of the interruption, like things really got interrupted. And I sort of really feel like, and the film was about that, and it really embraced that interruption, and it embraced the fact that the film does not capture the show. It does not try and preserve the show. It tries to, if you like, document the way the interruption cut into the show. So I'm still kind of, I think, processing that idea of interruption, and I'm not necessarily running to, for example, to get back to a black box studio, which isn't my favorite sort of environment in which to have an encounter with an audience. So no, I think for the time being, I really have no idea if or when there'll be a sort of live Gambini. I continue being really interested in magic and practicing magic, and I do a bit of teaching of magic as well. But yeah, in terms of the live on the stage, no idea. And yeah.
Well, I'm happy to hear you say no idea instead of no, because I'm a Gambini fan.
Hey.
And you know, I did want to say before we end this, just that I found this to be an incredibly moving piece of work about what it is to be an artist under this lockdown. And for me, that was a really, really satisfying and important thing to watch as an artist who's also had their life and career interrupted. I felt that there was a great kind of relief in seeing someone else be so, in seeing two other people make a piece of work that is so kind of artful and thoughtful and real about that, even though there was a fictional element. I mean, I felt that it was very real in a way. Yeah. I also want to say some admin, which I forgot to say at the beginning, which is that this was not captioned because we could not get the technology to live caption this Q&A. However, if you do want to watch it with captions, it is possible to watch it later. I think an hour from now or a little while from now, there'll be a recorded version of this Q&A online that can be captioned.
That's right.
So yeah, that's me, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Debbie. I just want to thank a couple of people just in closing. Thanks everyone for coming and sort of supporting this. It's, you know, this is work made for the community that shows up, and so so thank you for sort of tuning in and supporting this. Thank you, Debbie. Thanks, Debbie, for hosting this, and for having worked on, you know, the Tour of Enchantment like 2 or 3 years ago, whenever that was. And Hugo, I look forward to having a meal soon.
Yes.
And actually doing a high five.
Yeah. That'd be good.
Yeah, that would be good. I want to thank Steve Goatman, who's the producer I've been working on with for 2 years. He was actually really influential, because when the show was cancelled, it took us like a good year to set up the tour, and then of course it was cancelled. I had the idea, but I was very dispirited. I was like, well, I guess, you know, I could maybe do a video or something about the fact that, you know, Gambini's show was fictionally cancelled, and now it's actually cancelled. And it was Steve who said, I think that's a great idea and you should do it. And that's the only reason I've done it. So, you know, big applause for the producers who kind of get the artists out of their hesitant shells I want to thank, all the venues that have hosted the screening tonight. So that's Attenborough Centre for the Creative Arts, Colchester Arts Centre. These are two venues where I actually managed to perform the show before the cancellation. Camden People's Theatre in London, who have been fantastic. And also some of the venues that I was going to perform at, they weren't able to host the screening, but those are Slunglow Leeds, who've also have been amazing, Halifax Square Chapel and Dorchester Arts. And last but not least, big thanks to Anthony Pickersgill, who is the tech wizard who's enabled all of tonight to go so smoothly. So thank you, Anthony. And that's,
thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, and that's it. Okay.
Thank you,
Cheers,
Augusto.
guys.
Well,
Hope to see you
see you soon. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone. Goodbye, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. Bye.